To understand medieval justice for the poor, you first have to understand the world they lived in. It was not our world. There was no sense of equality. There was no idea that everyone deserved a fair shake. You were born into your place, and your place determined everything. If you were poor, you were almost certainly a peasant. And most peasants were serfs. A serf was not a slave, not exactly. You could not be bought and sold like a horse. But you were not free. You were tied to the land. You belonged to the manor, and the manor belonged to a lord. You worked the lord's land a few days a week. You gave him a portion of what you grew on your own small strip of land. You could not leave the manor without his permission. You could not marry without his permission. Your children were born into the same life. This was the structure of society. It was called feudalism. At the very top was the king. He owned all the land, in theory. He granted large chunks of it to his most powerful nobles, the barons and dukes. In exchange, they promised him soldiers and loyalty. These great lords then granted smaller parcels of their land to lesser lords or knights. And at the very bottom of this pyramid was you, the peasant. You had no land of your own. You just had the right to work a piece of it in exchange for your labor and your crops. This system was held together by two things: power and belief. The power was simple. The Lord had men with swords. You had a hoe. If you disobeyed, you could be fined, beaten, or thrown off your land. Being thrown off your land was a death sentence. With no land to farm, you would starve. So you did what you were told. The belief was more complex. It came from the church. The church was everywhere. It was the center of village life. It taught that God had created this order. The king was chosen by God. The Lord was your master by God's will, and you were a peasant because that was God's plan for you. To question this was to question God. The church preached that your suffering on earth was temporary. If you were obedient and hardworking, you would be rewarded in heaven. This was a powerful idea. It gave meaning to a life of hardship, and it made people accept their lot. Life was hard. You worked from sunup to sundown. The work was backbreaking, done with simple tools. Food was never guaranteed. A bad harvest could mean famine. Disease was common, and medicine was almost non-existent. You lived in a small, smoky hut with your family and maybe your animals. Your world was tiny. You probably never traveled more than a few miles from the village where you were born. Justice in this world was not about fairness as we think of it. It was about order. The most important thing was keeping the peace. The king's peace. This meant keeping society running as it was supposed to. It meant making sure everyone stayed in their place and did their duty. If you stole your neighbor's pig, you were not just harming your neighbor. You were disrupting the peace of the manor. You were upsetting the order, and that had to be punished. The goal was to restore order, not to find some abstract truth. The Lord, the king, they were not interested in your right. They were interested in keeping their world from falling apart, and they used the law as a tool to do that. It was a tool to control you, to extract money from you, and to reinforce their own power. So when a poor person faced the law, they were not walking into a neutral space. They were walking into a system designed by the powerful, for the powerful, a system that already saw them as a resource, a tool, a subject, not as a citizen with rights, and that colored every single interaction they had with medieval justice. If you were a poor person in the Middle Ages and you broke a rule, or someone broke a rule against you, where did you go? There wasn't one single court. There were layers of justice, like an onion, and the court you faced depended on who you were and what you had done. For a peasant, the most common and most important court was the one closest to home. This was the manorial court. Every manor had one. It was the lord's court held in his hall or sometimes just in a field. It met every few weeks. The lord himself might preside, or more often his steward, a man who managed the estate for him. This court dealt with the daily business of the village. It was the nuts and bolts of medieval justice for the poor. The cases were small, but they were huge to the people involved. Did you fail to show up for your required work on the Lord's land? You were in trouble. Did your cow wander into your neighbor's wheat field and eat the crop? You would have to answer for it. Did you get into a fist fight at the alehouse? The court would hear about it. Did you sell a weak ale or a stale loaf of bread? You would be fined. These were the things that made up life. And the manorial court regulated all of it. There was no lawyer to speak for you. You spoke for yourself. The jury was not an impartial group of strangers. It was a group of other villagers, usually the more substantial peasants. They knew you. They knew your family. They knew your reputation. This could be good or bad. If you were respected, they might be lenient. If you were known as a troublemaker, you had little chance. And the Lord, or his steward, was the judge. This was the key. The Lord was not a neutral party. He was your boss, and he had a direct financial interest in the outcome. Almost every punishment was a fine, and those fines went directly into the Lord's pocket. The manorial court was not just a tool for order, it was a source of income. So, there was always a pressure to find people guilty. Every offense, no matter how small, was a chance for the Lord to make a little money. This was the justice you knew best. It was personal, it was local, and it was deeply biased. If the crime was more serious, you might end up in a higher court. The next step up was the 100 Court or the Shire Court. These were older forms of justice from before the Norman conquest of England. They covered a wider area, a collection of villages, 100, or a whole county, a shire. Here, you might find more serious cases of theft or assault. A representative of the king, the sheriff, might be involved. But these courts were slow and became less important over time. For a poor person, they were just a more confusing, more expensive version of the Lord's court. The most serious crimes went to the royal courts. These were the king's courts. They dealt with murder, arson, rape, treason. These were crimes that broke the king's peace in a major way. The king would send his judges, called justices, to travel the country and hear these cases. This was a much more formal affair, but for a poor person, getting into a royal court was terrifying. You were far from home, you knew no one. The language might even be different, with officials speaking French or Latin. You were much more likely to be a defendant in a royal court than a plaintiff. Bringing a case yourself was incredibly expensive. You had to pay for rights, for officials, for everything. It was out of reach for almost any peasant. Finally, there was a whole separate system of justice. This was the church court or ecclesiastical court. The church had its own laws, called canon law. It had its own courts and its own punishments. These courts dealt with moral and spiritual offenses, sins. If you were accused of heresy, blasphemy, or witchcraft, you went to the church court. They also handled things like marriage disputes, inheritance, and adultery. Everyone, from the king to the lowest serf, was under the church's legal authority. The church courts were sometimes seen as a bit softer than the secular courts. They could not sentence someone to death, for example. Their goal was to save your soul, not just punish your body. Punishments might be a forced pilgrimage, a public whipping, or a penance. But they could also be terrifying, and the church had a powerful weapon, excommunication. To be excommunicated was to be cut off from the church. You could not receive the sacraments. You could not be buried in holy ground. In a world where belief was everything, it was a fate worse than death. For a poor person, life was a maze of different laws and different courts. You had to obey your Lord, your King, and your God. And each had a court waiting for you if you failed, so you're standing in a court. Maybe the Lord's court for letting your sheep stray, or maybe a royal court for a more serious crime. How does it work? How do they decide if you're guilty? We are used to the idea of evidence. In fingerprints, documents, witnesses cross-examined. None of that existed. Medieval justice had its own ways of finding the truth, and they were very different from ours. For most minor cases in the manorial court, it was simple. It was your word against your accusers. The decision was often made by the jury of your neighbors. They listened to both sides. They already knew you both. They made a judgment based on reputation and common sense. Who was more believable? Who was the known liar? It was rough justice, based on character more than facts. If things were more serious, you might need to rely on an oath. An oath was a sacred thing. You swore before God that you were telling the truth. To swear a false oath was a mortal sin, risking eternal damnation. This was a powerful deterrent. But what if it was still just your word against theirs? Then you used oath helpers, or compurgators. You would bring a number of people, often 12, to swear that they believed your oath was true. They were not witnesses to the crime. They were character witnesses. They were swearing that you were an honest, trustworthy person, and that your oath was clean. The number and status of the oath, helpers you needed depended on your own status and the severity of the crime. A nobleman would need fewer oath helpers than a peasant, and a peasant might struggle to find anyone willing to risk their own soul to swear for him. If you couldn't find enough oath helpers, you lost the case. But what if there were no witnesses? What if it was a secret crime like theft in the night? In these cases, when human justice was stumped, they turned to God. They asked God to provide a sign. This was the trial by ordeal. It seems barbaric to us now, but to the medieval mind it made a kind of sense. It was a way of getting the divine judgment when there was no other way. There were several kinds of ordeal. In the ordeal of hot water, you would plunge your hand into a boiling cauldron to retrieve a stone. Your hand was then bandaged and sealed. After 3 days, the bandage was removed. If the wound was healing cleanly, God had declared you innocent. If it was festering, you were guilty. The ordeal of hot iron was similar. You would have to carry a red-hot piece of iron for a set number of paces. Again, the healing of the burn decided your fate. For women, a common ordeal was the ordeal of cold water. You would be tied up and thrown into a river or pond that had been blessed by a priest, where water was considered pure. It would accept the innocent and reject the guilty, so if you sank, you were innocent. If you floated, the pure water had rejected you and you were guilty. Of course, if you sank, you might drown. But in theory, they were supposed to pull you out. These ordeals were not just random violence. They were religious ceremonies, a priest was always present, there were prayers and fasting beforehand. It was a deeply serious appeal to God. But in 1215, the church had a change of heart. The Pope declared that priests could no longer take part in trials by ordeal. Without the church's blessing, the ordeal lost its meaning. It quickly faded away, and this created a problem. How do you decide guilt now? The answer that slowly emerged was the trial jury. This was different from the jury of neighbors in the manorial court. This was a jury that listened to evidence and decided the facts of the case. The idea grew out of a practice where the king's officials would put a group of local men under oath and make them report on crimes in their area. Over time, this evolved. Instead of just accusing people, the jury started to be asked to rule on their guilt, or innocence. This was a huge change. It was the beginning of the system we know today, but it was a slow and messy process. Early juries were not impartial. They were made up of local people who knew the accused. They were expected to use their own knowledge of the events and the people. There were no rules of evidence. Some rumor and gossip could be presented as fact, and juries could be pressured. A lord or a powerful official could lean on a jury to get the verdict he wanted. So while the jury was a step away from superstition, it was not yet a guarantee of a fair trial, especially for a poor person who had no one to speak for them and who might have a bad reputation in the village. Being found guilty was a terrible thing. The punishments were harsh, and they were designed to do several things at once. They were meant to hurt you, to humiliate you, to take your money, and to serve as a terrifying warning to others. There was very little idea of rehabilitation. The goal was retribution and deterrence. For the vast majority of smaller crimes, the punishment was a fine. In the manorial court, almost everything resulted in a fine called an amercement. This was the lord's main way of making money from his court. The fines might seem small, a few pennies here and there. But for a peasant family that had almost no cash, any fine was a disaster. It could mean selling a pig or going into debt. It was a constant drain on the poor. Justice was profitable for the rich. If you couldn't pay a fine, or if the offense was more public, you might face punishments designed to shame you. The most common were the stocks and the pillory. In the stocks, your ankles were locked into a wooden frame. In the pillory, your head and hands were locked. You were put in a public place, like the village green or the marketplace, for hours or days. People could mock you, spit on you, or throw rotten food and animal dung at you. It was a powerful form of social control. In a small village where everyone knew you, public shame was a heavy burden to bear. For slightly more serious crimes, especially theft, the punishment was often physical. Whipping was common. You would be tied to a post and lashed with a whip, a public spectacle meant to show the price of crime. But the medieval world also used a punishment that seems particularly cruel to us: mutilation. A thief might have a hand cut off. A person who spread lies might have their tongue cut out. Someone caught poaching in the king's forest might be blinded. These punishments were not just about causing pain. They were about marking the criminal forever. A man with one hand was instantly recognizable as a thief. He carried his crime with him for the rest of his life. In a strange way, this was sometimes seen as a form of mercy. It was a way to punish someone severely without killing them. The ultimate punishment was death. And many, many crimes could lead to the gallows. Murder, of course, but also arson, treason, and grand larceny, which meant stealing goods worth more than a certain amount, sometimes as little as 1 shilling. For a poor man, hanging was the standard method of execution. It was a slow and agonizing death by strangulation. Executions were public events. Whole towns would turn out to watch. It was a form of grim entertainment, but also a final stark warning from the authorities. The body would often be left hanging for days to rot as a lesson to all who passed by. The rich and powerful were treated differently even in death. A nobleman convicted of a capital crime was usually granted the privilege of being beheaded with a sword or an axe. It was seen as a more honorable and quicker death. This difference sums up medieval justice perfectly. The law was not the same for everyone. Your status determined everything, from the court you faced to the way you died. There was one other fate that could befall a serious criminal outlawry. If you were accused of a major crime and you fled, refusing to come to court, you could be declared an outlaw. This meant you were no longer protected by the law. You were a wolf's head, meaning anyone could hunt you down and kill you without penalty. All your property was forfeited to the king or your lord. It was a civil death. You were erased from society. For a poor person with nowhere to go and no one to protect them, being declared an outlaw was a death sentence. And what about prisons? We think of prison as the main form of punishment today. But in the Middle Ages, long-term imprisonment was rare. Prisons existed, but they were mostly just holding pens. They were damp, filthy, disease-ridden dungeons where you were held until your trial or until you were let out to be executed. You weren't sentenced to 10 years in prison. The punishment was something done to your body or your wallet, not something done with your time. It is easy to paint a picture of medieval justice for the poor that is entirely bleak. And for the most part it was. The system was designed to control them, to profit from them, and to reinforce the power of the lords and the king. It was not a system based on rights or fairness, but human systems are never perfect. They always have cracks, loopholes, and unexpected pockets of mercy. Even for a peasant facing the law, there were sometimes small glimmers of hope. One of the most powerful forces was the community itself. In the local manorial court, your reputation was everything. The men of the jury were your neighbors. They knew if you were a good person who had made a mistake or a chronic troublemaker. They might choose to believe you over a less liked neighbor. They might recommend a smaller fine. The lord or his steward still had the final say, but a strong community reputation was the best defense a poor person had. Justice at the local level was deeply personal. This could work against you, but sometimes it could work for you. Then there was the church. While the church courts could be terrifying, the church also offered a unique form of protection, the right of sanctuary. If you were fleeing from the law, you could run to a church. Once you touched the church door, you were under God's protection. The authorities could not enter to arrest you. You had sanctuary. This was not a get-out-of-jail-free card. So you could not stay there forever. You're typically given 40 days. During that time, you had to decide what to do. Your only real option was to abjure the realm. This meant you would confess your crime to the coroner, and in return, you would be allowed to walk in disgrace to the nearest port and take a ship into exile. You had to leave the country and never return. You would lose everything, your family, your home, your land. It was a terrible choice, but it was better than the gallows. For many, sanctuary was the only way out. The church offered another strange loophole, known as benefit of clergy. Originally, this meant that members of the clergy, priests, and monks could only be tried in the more lenient church courts, not in the king's courts. This was a major source of conflict between kings and the church, but over time, the definition of a cleric got blurry. How do you prove you're a clergyman? The test became the ability to read. Specifically, you had to read a passage from the Bible. The standard verse became Psalm 51, which begins, Miserere me, Deus, or Have mercy on me, O God. It became known as the neck verse, because if you could read it, it could save your neck from the noose. In a world where almost no poor people were literate, this didn't help most. But it created an odd situation where any man who could read, even a common criminal, could claim benefit of clergy and escape a death sentence. He would be handed over to the church courts, where the punishment was usually much less severe. Finally, even in a system that seemed all-powerful, there was always the possibility of a direct appeal for mercy. A person could petition the king or a great lord. It was a long shot. It required someone to write the petition for you, and for it to somehow get into the right hands. But it did happen. Kings and queens would sometimes grant pardons, especially on religious holidays or to mark a special occasion. It was not a right, it was an act of grace, a reminder that the king held the power of life and death. But it was a chance. So, what was medieval justice like for the poor? It was biased. It was designed to maintain a deeply unequal social order. It was often brutal and driven by profit. A poor person entered the system at a massive disadvantage. Their word was worth less than a rich man's. They had no access to legal experts. They faced punishments that could ruin them or end their lives for offenses that a lord might commit without a second thought. And yet, it was not a perfectly efficient machine of oppression. It was a messy human system. In the power of a local community's opinion, in the sacred space of a church, in the strange loophole of the neck verse, and in the faint hope of a royal pardon, a poor person could sometimes find a way to survive. These glimmers of hope do not erase the fundamental unfairness of the system, but they remind us that even in the harshest of worlds, there are always small spaces for mercy, for luck, and for the stubborn human will to live.